what if rather than sort of asking people to abstain, what if we kind of double down on that? Humans seem to want to surround themselves with objects they love.
Christine Harold is a professor of communication at the University of Washington. Her new book, Things Worth Keeping: The Value of Attachment in a Disposable World, investigates the attachments we form to the objects we buy, keep, and discard, and explores how these attachments might be marshaled to create less wasteful practices and balance our consumerist and ecological impulses. Nicole Seymour is a professor of English based in Southern California, whose book Bad Environmentalism: Irony and Irreverence in the Ecological Age seeks out a new way to talk about environmentalism that is less performance and self-righteousness and embraces irony and humor. As the novel coronavirus pandemic continues to rage in the United States, consumption is on pause for a lot of people, and these two scholars are here to talk about what that means. This conversation was recorded in October 2020.
Okay. Hi, this is Nicole Seymour.
Hi, this is Christine Harold.
So I was one of the reviewers for Christine's book in manuscript form, and I'm really excited that it's out in the world right now and that I get to talk to you about it. And I have to say, I wasn't sure if you would hate me for using a swear word in the blurb on the back of your book.
I loved it, actually.
Okay, good. I just figured now is the time, to tell me if you do hate me. But so I think it was something like Westerners buy too much shit, but you should definitely buy this book. So I'm paraphrasing a little bit there. So your book seems to be motivated in large part by concern over the environmental impact of Western consumerism, specifically the waste it produces. And I really love this point you make about how part of the solution is learning to care about objects. So not just caring about the earth, which is being polluted, or workers who are being exploited. In other words, we need to become stewards of objects, not just stewards of place or people. And one of the ways we can do that is by, as you say, opening up the object. So I wanted to start by asking you to just explain more what you mean by this idea of opening up the object.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. You're right that one of the kind of operating premises of the book is that so much environmental rhetoric, for all its good intentions, at least as it relates to consumer culture, which is my primary object of study, environmentalist rhetoric tends to ask us to, if you care about the earth, if you care about pollution or human rights and so on, then the answer to that is to stop shopping, right? We have lots of movements that are, buy nothing day and stop shopping campaigns and so on. And I think that those things have a certain utility, to be sure, as consciousness raising efforts. But I think at the end of the day, they haven't proved as effective as they might. And so, one of the things that I really try to grapple with in the book is what if rather than sort of asking people to abstain, to reject that part of themselves that loves things, what if we kind of doubled down on that and capitalized on it and kind of took advantage of the fact that humans seem to want to surround themselves with objects they love, to make objects they love, to take things that is to say that my part of my argument is that what if we take things more seriously rather than less. And so one of the ways that I do that, so I'm a scholar of rhetoric, so I really look at the ways that we use certainly language, images, signs, but also objects to kind of influence the ways that people think, behave, and believe. And so this project was kind of trying to look at what are some of the roadblocks to us really having a more intimate relationship with objects, and what are some practices that people are engaging in that are an attempt to kind of problematize that. So yeah, so the book really unfolds through what I talk about as a kind of intensifying or an escalating deconstruction of objects, at least in the case as the case studies unfold. So I start with Target and the ways in which Target, as a marketer, as a corporation, really foreground design as their central kind of brand identity, right? That we make design for all. Like IKEA and others, they really celebrate what they call a democratization of design. And as I argue in the book, at the end of the day, Target, really sells a version of design where it's kind of a dressing up of objects. Their structure and the conditions of their manufacture are really no different than something you might buy at, say, Walmart, but that they're kind of dressed up in a skin of design. Nevertheless, they do kind of promote an awareness or an interest in designers, in a kind of a design vocabulary, and so on. And I can talk about that more. But at the end of the day, the model still kind of treats objects as this kind of discrete other to ourselves. It's this thing on the shelf in a store that I covet in some way. I take it home. It's there to do my bidding. It's there for my use or it's there for my pleasure. But and I have no obligation to it once it loses its shine. I can just toss it onto the landfill. But then I look at other case studies like IKEA, for example. IKEA for most of its products are ones that you have to bring home and assemble yourself, and engage in, at least in their assembly, right? Not in their manufacture necessarily, but at least the object is kind of opening up, right? So you see lots of people taking advantage of that through things like IKEA hacking. That there's something almost Lego-esque about IKEA components that for some people sparks their creativity. There's also a dynamic in which just the labor of sitting down and spending an afternoon putting together a Billy bookcase, that's an investment. That's an investment of your energy, of your patience, of your time, in a way that kind of opens the object up as something that's malleable, that you imprint on in a particular way. Like, I recognize that these are kind of cookie cutter components that make completely homogenous objects potentially. Nevertheless, there's kind of an opening up that invites our investment. And then I move on to look at other approaches to making and design, and modes of design that invite us to imprint our stories on objects. And so I kind of trace this escalating opening up of objects in ways that my hope is, anyway, that we can see like new moments in the life of an object, from the harvesting of its materials to its manufacture, to its marketing, to its consumption, to what do we do with it once it's in our homes, what do we do with it once we're done with it. That there's this kind of way in which there's a rhetorical opening up that offers opportunities for us to intervene in different ways, rather than just the traditional model where it's like, it's there for me on the store shelf, I chuck it when I'm done with it. I'm interested in like looking for new points of intervention.
Yeah, I think the other reason I really like this idea of opening up the object is that it's both literal and figurative, right? So there's moments where this idea of like, you can watch a video, as I did when I actually moved to Germany. Like, I watched a video on how I could take out my SIM card and replace it with a German SIM card using a paper clip, right? And I was like, oh my God, I'm a genius. So there's these ways you're literally, potentially opening objects, but also opening them up in figurative ways, like affectively, right? Making new connections to them and so forth. So I was also really struck by one of the claims in your introduction that designers are the most under-acknowledged and understudied communicators in our Western and perhaps the world at large. And so I was wondering if you could speak more about this idea and why it's important. So why should we see designers as communicators, or what potentially changes if we do see them as such?
Yeah, so this book is really building off of my first book, also with University of Minnesota Press, Our Space, which was looking at the challenges or activists who wanted to challenge corporate branding rhetoric. So things like culture jamming or copyright pirating, really taking people who wanted to challenge corporations by way of their brands. And one of the things I argue in that book is that becomes possible as a terrain of contestation, because people, there's a whole generation, my generation, Generation X and beyond, millennials and younger, who have been reared in a world of branding, that we're literate in the grammar and the vocabulary and the syntax of branding. And therefore it becomes one of the kind of arrows in our quiver as activists or people who want to make change. Being literate in branding was really important. One of the things that I'm arguing in this book, or at least a kind of context in which I imagined this book, is that branding hasn't gone away for sure. I mean, branding is obviously still saturates our culture, but it's really, design is really the kind of the next generation of branding, right? So it's not just about, does my device have an apple on it, or does it have like a clever campaign on TV that that makes me want it, but the actual form, function, the way it feels in my hand, the interface, those sorts of things. We're becoming increasingly literate in that language as well. One of the things about design, and Bruce Mao, who's a famous designer, makes this comment, that the goal of good design is to be invisible. Right, to be in that old cliche of like water to a fish, where we're influenced by design all the time, but good design doesn't really announce itself. As a rhetoric scholar, as a communication scholar, I'm really interested in that, right? That it's a design of interfaces, it's a style of communication or a mode of communication, but one that kind of purposely wants to be invisible in ways. And I think, we could look at, again, what I was suggesting about Target is one way, and IKEA. Those are one kind of way in which we've become conversant in some ways in the language of design. Certainly in our high-tech gadgets, we're becoming increasingly conversant in, what's the footprint, what's its interface, those sorts of things. And so I think it's just kind of the next terrain in which people can say, okay, well, there's a version of design that you might find at Target, which, as I was suggesting before, is sort of like making mass produced things, plastic widgets from China, look pretty or look like they're mid-century modern or whatever, right? That it's kind of a skinning operation. That's kind of design as decoration, right? But then there's a whole host of other designers, people, again, of generations who were reared in the vocabulary of design, who are saying either let's design things with more sustainable materials, with more sustainable production practices, or those that I look at in the book more closely, designers who say, are there ways that we can actually embed in the form of an object some components that open it up to us imprinting on it emotionally, or invite us to imbue it with story, and so on. And so let alone just all of the people who are engaged in crafting and making things and so on. So we're seeing this kind of return to everyday people being manufacturers of sorts and exploring. And as we know from like the great work on media literacy, the best way to teach people to be media literate, for example, is to just get them making a video or teach them to make a podcast, right? Get them literate in the doing.
Are we podcast literate now? This is my first podcast. I don't know. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, of course, I felt like I had to ask you a pandemic question
Yeah.
because everyone's talking about it. But I noticed probably a month into our lockdown or semi-lockdown that I hadn't been shopping, and not just in a sort of like, obviously I hadn't been going out and shopping, but I also wasn't shopping online, which you still could, and part of the reason I think is that I just wasn't seeing other people. I wasn't seeing, you see a friend and they talk about, this like new outfit I just bought, or, I bought tickets to this thing or whatever. And so the social aspect of consumerism wasn't there for me anymore. And so, and also, thinking back on this period and rereading your book, I'm just thinking about how much time I was spending in my apartment and just, reconnecting with all of my objects and, spending more time with them than I usually do. So I'm just curious if you personally had a similar experience, And maybe if more broadly you think that the arguments of your book have taken on different resonance in the past few months.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. So exactly what you say, right? That there's this performative quality to at least certain versions of consumption. So as you've probably read, I don't have data on this, but just from reading various culture pieces, that the fashion industry has taken a huge hit recently. Things like athleisure are doing quite well, right? Comfort clothes, but clothes that are specifically fashion, it's really hurting, right? Because there's not that performative quality, or there's not the context for it right now. So yeah, so I think there's a few ways in which it seems like our consumption practices are being interrupted right now that are really pertinent to some of the themes of the book. First is that we see this huge. So one of the chapters in the book looks at the kind of seemingly really disparate practices of Marie Kondo's KonMari method of decluttering and hoarding. So, looking at kind of our relationship to clutter, for example, you've probably heard this term, or at least it will resonate with you, even if you haven't heard it, corona cleaning, right? So, there's been all these articles about people engaging in corona cleaning and, cleaning out their homes since they're spending so much time in their homes. So, for example, the Goodwill, the big Goodwill in Los Angeles had to take out advertisements just saying, please stop bringing things to us because they couldn't accommodate all of just the onslaught of stuff that was being donated to them. So I think there's that dynamic when we're really kind of reevaluating our spaces and nesting in new ways. But then, of course, you're also hearing a lot about people taking up old hobbies or doing DIY projects, crafting, making bread, doing those kind of self-sufficient, pleasurable, old school activities that, at least for now, do kind of interrupt the consumerist impulse, which is like, I'll just go buy the thing, right? So in addition to that, as you mentioned, right, lots of people are shopping less, or at least they're shopping differently. And so I think there is a really a significant I mean, let alone the fact that people not don't just can't go into stores like they used to, but as we know, lots of people are furloughed, laid off, out of work, have other expenses. So consumption is on pause for a lot of people. Obviously it's hard to know how repatterned things are going to be once things kind of get back. I know we're not going back to normal, but getting back to being in person again. I suspect just a lot of our old habits will just come back. But I also think that there is a significant repatterning that's happening, that does have some potential.
And I should say, of course, that from my perspective as the person who could teach online, that not everyone had the luxury of connecting again with their objects because they were saving lives and being essential workers. But yeah, I do think that based on social media, there was this sense of nesting, as you say. And I was also reading today that sales of houseplants have exploded over the past couple months, which is in keeping with this larger trend of apparently millennials and Gen Z are, now this huge houseplant buying sector. Maybe a wacky question, but I'll just throw it out there. I'm thinking about something like a plant and how that is and maybe isn't an object in the way that you're writing about in the book, right? But at least the narrative around the houseplant explosion is, Gen Z and millennials can't afford houses, so they need to make their tiny apartments look cute. They have to have something to care for, and you don't write about plants, but you do mention a couple examples of objects that are created by designers. They're objects that need us, quote unquote, right? They're almost like a Tamagotchi kind of way. So you write about this trash can that turns itself toward the wall when it needs to be taken out, and that sort of thing. So maybe you could just talk a little bit more about this idea of objects that train us to care for them, and maybe what is and isn't an object, right? Does a plant count as a consumer object or not because it's a living thing?
Yes, and you forgot the trash or the vacuum cleaner that poops out its its dust bag. That's a work of a designer named Hiren Shin who did this, admittedly kind of experimental or kind of conceptual series of appliances that she designed. I mean, they're very cute. They're in pastel colors, really rounded edges. It's a toaster, a trash can, and a vacuum cleaner, and they all are designed in such a way that they call attention to themselves as needing you. So if the crumb tray gets full on the toaster, it kind of makes a sneezing motion, and so on. Her premise is that, one of the reasons we're wired to love babies because they're so helpless that we need to tend to their needs. And so she was interested in, like, what if I made objects that also kind of demanded attention in the way that a baby does. And she did this with an eye toward attachment, right? Fostering attachment in the way that we attach to babies. And so, yeah, I love the example of houseplants. And I don't know that they would count as an object, but they certainly count as a commodity, right? They're something that we acquire. They are a unit of exchange. And yeah, I do see the trend toward, like, I see like the plant lady t-shirts and, all of the macrame hanging, devices, and just the kind of rise of houseplants. And I think you're right that probably has something to do with when people might not be able to buy a home, but they can really nest in the home that they have. But I think there's something about houseplants that, like the objects that Shin made, they demand our attention. They invite our investment. And I do think that they contribute to a kind of an opening up, or a kind of a literacy, right? So if you have a home that's, when you're surrounded by houseplants and you're starting to learn, how much light does this one need? How much water does that one need? Maybe I should position this one in the north window, or, whatever. You're starting to develop a literacy, right? A capacity to tend to the needs of something outside yourself. And I would say that at a formal level, that in and of itself kind of repatterns the consumer model, the way of being that we're invited to inhabit by consumer culture, where it's like everything's there for me. Does it delight me? Does it give me joy? If it doesn't, chuck it. Right. And I think plants are an interesting example of, let's just say object. I think they're probably not objects necessarily, but commodities that kind of force us out of that pattern, because we have to say, what does it need? It's starting to look kind of wilted, or it's starting to look kind of brown. It's a tuning in to something outside yourself that I think is fundamentally powerful. And then maybe if you go baby, right, it cultivates a hunger to get out into the natural world, and maybe you're tuning in there a little bit more too, because you've honed it a bit at home.
Well, I was thinking about you just mentioned your hoarding chapter, and I think you even mentioned that maybe it was an Animal Planet show, like animal hoarders, right? But then I was like, there's something about, like, is there such a thing as plant hoarders? Because it almost seems like on Instagram, like the more the better, right? You could have like
Yeah.
hundreds of plants, and then people are actually jealous of you rather than sort of horrified by it. But yeah, again, it's this question of, I guess it's a form of consumption that sort of reflects positively on you, whereas other forms reflect negatively.
You're right that it does seem like the more the better. I mean, I have that attitude in my home, right? I regularly grab a plant. Just when I'm at the grocery store, I see a plant I like, I'll grab it and find a place for it. Never do I go out and say, I'm looking for a particular kind of plant. I just pick them up, right? And yeah, no, I don't think we have quite the same sort of shame. Plants aren't really clutter, I think, for most people.
This does remind me, though, that that's the chapter where you talk about Marie Kondo, and I promised to tell you about
Yes, please.
Marie Kondo at the Oscars. I can't say I actually met her. I just saw her from afar. But I have a friend who works for the library of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. So he's a librarian for the Oscars, basically. And so he got me a ticket as a seat filler. I was a lowly seat filler.
That's so cool.
It was amazing. But I was in the lobby, and I saw this person, and I'm usually good at recognizing celebrities, and I recognized her face, but she was out of place because I was like, I know who she is, but she's not an actress. I was so confused. And I was like, oh my God, it's Marie Kondo. And then I ran into her at a cocktail party later that night, and then a third time at the ballet. And so I just felt like this is 2 years ago, or I guess a year and a half ago. But she was very of the moment, and I just thought that was, she's made it. She's definitely made it. That she's got that invite to the Oscars. I don't know that she got the invite the next year.
She definitely had a huge moment. I mean, I think she's still very popular, but yes, it was when the show launched in January of, what was it, 2019. People just couldn't get enough of her. And so many people who knew that I was writing, have a chapter that engages her. I can't tell you how many emails and texts that I get from friends and colleagues around the country just saying, "Did you see this? Did you see that?" And of course, with this, there's this new show on Netflix based on the Home Edit Instagram feed that's very popular. Lots of people texting me about that as well.
One of the things I was thinking about is you already kind of mentioned earlier this idea of your skepticism around consciousness raising, right? This idea that if you just, for example, show people a picture of a garbage dump filled with castaway toys and clothes or whatever, people will stop buying those things. And your argument, just to reiterate, is that you're saying we need to ask instead. Well, also ask. How can we design and also care for things differently such that we don't want to throw them away in the first place, right? And I wrote in my book a lot about just against this sort of idea of gotcha environmentalism or expose environmentalism or whatever you want to call it. This idea that you just need to show people, right, that there's this phrase called the knowledge deficit hypothesis, right, that it's people just don't know and they need to know, or they need to be shown, or they need to see it, and that's really what's going to change things. And I come from this more cynical viewpoint. It sounds like you do a bit as well, which is people know things are bad. People people know that they buy too much stuff. We're way past that point. And so I just I appreciated sort of seeing your take on that from from a different angle, or sort of using different examples. And then the other thing I was thinking a lot about is that we're both really interested in feelings and affect, including pleasure. And I was just thinking that for you, it's this idea of critical consumerism, right? A critical consumerism without pleasure won't work, right? We just need to locate the pleasure points in different places, perhaps. But just telling people, stop buying things, just be this austerity approach doesn't really work, right? And for me, it's more about like an environmentalism without pleasure will not work. And again, an environmentalism that's all about sort of what you're doing is bad, and cut it out and so forth. So yes, I think in a lot of interesting ways we sort of have the same spirit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I loved that too. And I think it's the opening quote of my of my introduction. I cite Juliet Shore. I can't reproduce the quote, but she basically says, like, it's not about donning a hair shirt, right? Like, we don't need to flagellate ourselves in order to make good choices. And I think we both, me through the lens of consumer culture, and I think you explore it in a broader sense, looking at kind of the ways we talk about environmentalism itself. Absolutely. I mean, I think I quote Sloterdijk and you quote others, to kind of take this posture of, we have lots of evidence that say smoking is bad for you, and yet people still smoke, right? It's not just about a knowledge deficit. It's about helping or to provide ways of repatterning people's desires and forging new kinds of pleasure, and so on, at least as part of the conversation, right? It might not exhaust the possibilities, but I think we both agree, at least in our work, that that a kind of a austerity, abstinence, refraining, purity overdetermines the discourse. And I wanted to ask you, your book, Bad Environmentalism. First, I would love to hear you kind of explain what you mean by that, but then to kind of hear you talk about ways that it interrupts that tendency of environmentalist rhetoric to be overdetermined by these things like purity and certainty and a certain version of wearing a hair shirt, right, if you care about the environment.
Yeah, so I just think of it as environmentalism in a different tenor with a different spirit. So all the texts, all the examples I look at, whether it's performance art or stand-up comedy or animation, you can locate in all of these texts a very real concern for the environment, for, environmental injustice and so forth, but they're just not doing the killjoy environmentalism. They're not doing the gloom and doom. They're not doing the didactic sort of like, I'm here to tell you again, here to show you the facts. And a lot of these examples come from, I think, a dissatisfaction with mainstream environmentalism, not just in the affective sense, as I'm suggesting, right? Not just the guilt that I guess we're both talking about, right? Not just a dissatisfaction with the guilt, but a dissatisfaction with the ways in which those affective modes are really tied up with normative social stances, right? So mainstream environmentalism can be very heteronormative, can be very white, very ableist, and so the examples I'm looking at come from queer environmentalists that are like, hey, let's dress up in like really gaudy clothes and be very excessive and be very indulgent in all these things that environmentalists are not supposed to be. Yeah, so I really connect the sort of affective modes that they're working with to these social dynamics or these sort of social demographics that they're coming from. And I was just I'm working on a new book right now, which is actually about glitter. And there's all these biodegradable brands of glitter that are coming out now, which is like the perfect
Sure. Are they
expression.
sugar or?
Some are made of sugar, some are made of cellulose, and I'm actually interviewing a eco glitter manufacturer tomorrow. So I will find out more about all the natural minerals. But to me, that's just sort of like the perfect expression of that environmentalism, right? This idea that you want to be ostentatious, you want to be ridiculous, you want to be indulgent, you want to be over the top, you want to be excessive, but you actually do care about the environment. So
Yeah, I mean, I think both of us are coming from a perspective that at least wants to look at the ways in which, because I'm looking at kind of attachment, investment. It's hard to get people to invest in a negative, right? To invest in a mode of discourse that kind of where you're constantly judging yourself, right? And I think the kinds of things that you're looking at, yeah, they're ostentatious, they're kind of ridiculous and so on. And I think there's a really cool way in which that's hijacking or repatterning. So much of environmentalism seems to be about a kind of, and you talk about this in your final chapter, a kind of aspirational lifestyle brand, right? There's almost a look, right? There's either the kind of white middle class Whole Foods shopping mom version, or there's the kind of old school like hippie version, which I think is less prevalent nowadays. But there is a way in which mainstream environmentalism kind of gets reduced to consumer choices. Where do you shop? What kind of look, right? Like, does your home have? What kind of look does your style have? And there's a weird kind of aesthetic minimalism that comes with that might not be green at all, but it's almost like the sign of a particular, like, I'm someone who's constrained and living minimally and so on, when really it's just a kind of an aesthetic choice. And I'm just really interested in the examples that you point to in bad environmentalism really challenge that. And so I'm interested in hearing you kind of talk about, they offer an alternative aesthetic and style and like approach, but it's more than that too. It's almost like they offer another form as well. And so one of the things that I thought was really interesting in your introduction, you say that much environmentalist rhetoric tends to privilege things like proximity and presence, that might make them kind of allergic to the distancing mode that irony brings. And I just would be interested to hear you talk about that sort of, because you're not, bad environmentalism isn't just like a different aesthetic, it's a different structure too.
right. So I mentioned, yeah, definitely irony is all over the book, and I'll talk about that in one second. But when you said form, I was thinking about how a lot of the forms I talk about are understood to be trashy to begin with and understood to be non-environmentalist to begin with. So something like animation is considered, it's exaggerated, right? It's crude, unless you're talking about a few exceptions like Pixar or the Spirited Away, things like The Simpsons, which I write about. and the good family are, they're not beautiful, right? It's just like the form of it is actually not beautiful. And
Right. There's a vulgarity to it.
exactly, and we think of environmentalist texts as being beautiful, right? That how could you, think about Rachel Carson, we have to stoke wonder, right? And her prose itself has to be wondrous. It has to be beautiful. And so a lot of the texts that I'm talking about are by their very form not thought of or not believed to be environmentalists. And then the irony that they all have in some sense is, as you said, irony is associated with distance, like emotional distancing, right? That you're too cool to care about something, right? You got to make a joke or whatever. And I've come to think of irony in such a different way since I've written this book, and my own personal mode is like I make a joke about absolutely everything, right? Like I'm constantly compulsion, and for me, it's protection, right? It's this idea of you know God thinks they're so grim, and like I said before, we all know how grim they are. We live it. And so there's a way in which I think these texts and just me as a person, we sort of we need to have a little bit of cushioning to get through the day.
Is that the distancing?
Yeah, it's a self-protection mode. Um, but at the same time, a lot of these texts are, and this is the other sort of crucial part of the whole book's argument is almost all of these texts are self-reflective and self-reflexive, and they're making fun of themselves. They're not just making fun of other things, right? So if we go back to that, you mentioned smoking earlier. There's this famous moment in Inconvenient Truth where Al Gore shows these old pictures of like smoking ads, right? And just showing the ads where they're like, 9 out of 10 doctors agree that like, cigarettes are great. But just even showing these ads, people laugh automatically, right? Because there's this sense of, oh, they're so dumb, they didn't know, and we know better, right? And I think a lot of environmentalists take that approach, which is like, we've just got to reveal that, shell oil is, evil, and then we can feel superior and ta-da, we've pulled the curtain off of shell oil and we see it for what it is or whatever. And so these texts are ironic in that sense, right? That it's what Bronislaw Zerzinski calls a corrective irony. So they're using irony, I should say, when environmentalists do use irony, which is rare, it's to do that kind of corrective irony, to say like, oh, we know so much better, we know better than.
Right. You thought it was this one thing, but really it's this other thing.
Exactly, exactly. And so what's different about the texts that I talk about is they make fun of themselves as well. So they're not taking this superior standpoint, which I think makes them more approachable and doesn't get them into that, even though they are using irony, which is distancing, they can still connect to an audience because they can say, yeah, I'm a mess too, right? Like, either I still like to buy things too, yet I care about the environment. So yeah.
Right. I love that. Yeah. So this makes me think of this other. See if I can articulate this thing that I think both of our projects share, but in different ways. So for my work, I'm kind of walking a careful line, looking at really like some of my examples are really like the epitome of like consumer big corporate consumer brands, right? Like Target, IKEA, and so on. And yet I'm not just taking a stand of like they're bad for the environment, they promote waste, right? That I'm wanting to look for like more like what are they a symptom of? Why is it that this appeal to design seems to speak to people so much? I'm interested in kind of looking for like, yes, obviously Target isn't a path to kind of greener living, but there is this kind of opening up of a particular vocabulary and so on that I talked about earlier. Or I look at other examples again that are kind of playful and a little bit more ambiguous and aren't perfect, I guess, from an environment. Like if you were sort of evaluating it on purely green terms, none of my examples are what you could call perfect. And yours, of course, that's kind of fundamental to bad environmentalism, but also kind of a queer approach in general, where you're playing up playfulness, ambiguity, and so on. So one of the things I've often grappled with, and I'm just wondering if you do too, is that irony and ambiguity. I agree with you that they're more productive in terms of just like opening up a new space. Um, and new patterns of practice and being and so on. But is there a downside to ambiguity? Are there risks in having one's message be so open for interpretation, especially in a time when, as you say, I was devastated by that anecdote you tell in the beginning of your book about like how the Senate declared climate change real, and then what it was, and then like 15 minutes later voted that it. Can you explain that?
Oh yeah, yeah. 15 minutes later, the second resolution was that it was not man-made. It was not. It wasn't our fault. So climate change is real, but we didn't do it. Uh,
Right. I was just blown away. So given that that's still like a matter of debate, um, in some ways seems to call for a response that's like fact-based and certain and pure. Do you know what I'm saying? So do you ever struggle with like that question of ambiguity in a time where even those we're kind of trying to challenge are themselves ambiguous?
yeah, I mean, not. I don't want to say that like I've given up fighting for like belief
Facts.
in like or whatever. Like, I don't want to say that like I drank the fake news Kool-Aid or whatever. But I was just thinking today about AOC. Tweeted something about you guys attacked me for getting a $200 haircut, and now Trump spent $70,000 on his haircuts, and I mean that can go back and forth forever, right? Where it's just kind of they don't care about facts, right? So we that's already it's been established. They don't care. How are you going to fight with facts with someone who doesn't care about the facts or whatever? So and again, maybe this is just my deep cynicism where I think we're somewhere else right now. Like I don't think we're back in that zone if we ever were of like the knowledge deficit hypothesis where it's once you point out that $70,000 on his hair, everyone's going to apologize to AOC or something. That's where we've so past that moment. So I guess I'm just interested in the fact that people, these comedians that I'm talking about, these stand-up comedians or these animators or these drag queens or who all these people I'm talking about in my book are just sort of like, let's just try something else. Let's just try a different approach. And I did have this moment writing this book where I was in this crisis where I was like, do I want to endorse all of these things? I write about this show called Wild Boys. It's sort of a nature program parody, and people can be very offended by it, right? It's very un-PC. And I had this moment where I was like, is that what I'm trying to do with this book? Am I trying to say like, look, these examples are a better way to do environmentalism? And I realized that's not really the point of the book. It's to say these examples already exist. We just haven't noticed them. And what does it mean that they exist, right? What does it mean that so many people feel the need to do stand-up comedy about the environment in a world that thinks of environmentalists as killjoys, right? Like there's this other narrative that's happening that we're not paying attention to, and we just need to pay attention to it and sort of think about, again, what does it mean that someone who's a vegan, as Steve-O, who's the star of Wild Boys, he's a vegan, but he doesn't want to make a serious vegan TV show. He wants to make a ridiculous stunt TV show where like being chased around, like butt naked by a hyena or whatever. Like, what does it mean that someone is like, that's how I want to tell the world about my veganism is by like, running around naked on a television screen. And so, yeah, I guess, maybe this is a cop out, but, at the end of the day, I think I just say, the proof is already out there that people want a different way to feel and to talk about environmentalism, whether it's right or wrong. This is just it's what's already happening. We just haven't paid attention.
No, absolutely. And I think, just going back to where I think we both agree that like the traditional message of like, look at the facts, or I'm going to expose this particular corporate evil, and then people will behave accordingly. Um, in my first book, I look at this example of this organization called the Biotic Baking Brigade, and they say that their slogan is to pie pompous people. And what they would do is they would go to public events, and so they would pie people like Milton Friedman and Bill Gates and whoever was the CEO, I can't remember his name, of Chevron at the time, and other like corporate polluters or economists and so on. And they would just put a pie in their face, right? And they would record it. And it's ridiculous, but it's also this like moment of rupture. And then, of course, you stick a pie in the face of Bill Gates, then the cameras are going to turn to you and say, why did you do that? Then suddenly you have an opportunity to say why you did that. Any good art, or lots of bad art too, kind of makes people scratch their heads and be like, what is that about? And I think that's way more of a moment that we want to create more of those moments where people can kind of, where something is interrupted. And I would argue that the traditional environmentalist message is the status, it, like, people are very accustomed to it. And so it's not disruptive, right? But the kinds of things you're looking at are disruptive in the way that they, make people go, huh? Right. And in that moment, there's an opportunity there for people to self persuade or to think a little bit differently, even in small ways, about things that they thought, oh, environmentalism is just for those white ladies at Whole Foods or the hippies or whatever. I think those moments of disruption, even if there's not a clear prescription that follows it, like, you saw me naked, now go vegan, right? It's not necessarily that, but it's just this disruptive moment that could potentially reboot things in a way.
Right, absolutely. So yeah, these bad environmentalist texts, I think of them as, like they are disrupting environmental destruction, but they're also disrupting environmentalism, and that those two
Right.
things are going together at the same time. So you were talking about branding as sort of, this was the place that, your previous book was sort of oscillating with, that sort of like where the world was also sort of thinking of consumerism, and then you said, design is sort of the next thing, and what's next, right? What comes after branding and design? What's the next book? Maybe is another way to ask that.
So I'm not sure at this stage if I've got another book in me, but I have an idea that I'm toying with. So I'm not sure if I'm going to execute on it or not, if it's like an article or a book or what. So, and also I'm concerned because there's a lot being done on it. My work always tends to be kind of like, I approach things as symptoms, right? That is to say, in rhetorical scholarship, a lot of times people will look at a rhetorical text and then look at what it causes in the world. Um, but I'm more interested in looking at rhetorical trends or consumer trends, in terms of my work, as like, what is that a symptom of? Like, what does that tell us about the moment we're in contemporary capitalism, right? Like, why is this thing popular? And so I'm really drawn towards all the debates around mindfulness and wellness, and the way that the why is that. So I'm not 100% sure where I'm going with that. And obviously, there's tons being written about it right now, and lots of people challenging it as McMindfulness, and that it's just about making better workers, right? That you have lots of companies and universities that have mindfulness programs as part of their wellness, through their HR departments and so on. There's lots of criticism of that. There's lots of criticism of the Army's MindFit program that is, basically mindfulness for soldiers. Lots and lots of police departments across the country have various mindfulness programs. And so the critique is, of course, well, we're just making better killers, better soldiers, and so on. I'm interested in those debates. I'm interested in the debates around mindfulness in schools and the challenges that you get largely from religious organization, Christian organizations who don't, are concerned about that being sort of Buddhism or yoga through the back door. But primarily I'm interested in the commodification of all of that. The commodification of consciousness is how I'm thinking about it.
I mean, it fits in with the plants because, it's all about
Yeah.
things. To me are all sort of, I'm sort of like an old millennial. I'm technically like a year too old to be a millennial, but I don't know. I still feel very millennial.
You
And so,
identify. Yeah, and I think a lot of it is how you identify culturally.
yeah. But no, definitely I feel like this, the meditation, the wellness, the self-care, the plants, it's all part of, an aesthetic, the yoga. And yeah, I mean, I do feel like more and more some of these things are just uh, ways for us to cope with, these horrible things that are happening in the world rather than stopping the horrible things that are happening in the world. But
Yeah, I mean, one time when area it gets concerning is just when it's all about sort of. I mean, there's certain versions of this kind of spirituality or mindfulness where it's just all about you imbuing yourself with the fortitude to kind of move through the world. And then there's other versions of it that are much more about opening yourself up, where a lot of the plant medicine stuff, right, around like psilocybin and ayahuasca and that sort of stuff is a very different patterning. It's a lot about opening yourself up and dissolving the boundaries of self. But then there's other versions of like self-care and whatnot that are all about doubling down on the notion of the self that consumerism depends upon, right? That's usually my take on most things, right? That it's like it kind of can go both ways. Sometimes the commodification of something can be a good thing because it has the power of capital behind it to popularize things that otherwise were on the fringe. And I think sometimes that's really powerful. But then, of course, a lot of times it gets hollowed out in the process. The content of it gets hollowed out in the process.
I always go back to this. I can send you a link later, but there's somewhere online. There's this. It's called something like 10 self-care activities that don't cost money. I just feel like that's the we still
Yeah.
the thread of self-care where it seemed like such a great idea and it was absolutely what we needed, and then it turned out that it, it was just another way to sell things.
Yeah,
But
once Gwyneth Paltrow gets her hands on it, it becomes, I'm interested in reading what you write about plants in the kind of critical theory world, as I'm sure you know. There's all this interesting work. Two of my mentors at Penn State, um, Rich Doyle and Jeff Nealon, both have written about plants, and I just think it's such an interesting area of study. By the way, have you seen this Apple movie, the documentary about mushrooms that's coming out?
no,
I can't remember what it's called. I'll send you the link. It looks really interesting.
I haven't decided, but there's definitely something going on about there's these young people that call themselves plant sexuals, and there's sort of this now. Well, yeah, so like the claim is that not only are millennials and Gen Z, not only can they not afford to buy houses, and so they have all these houseplants, but they're also having children later and fewer, and so there's a bit of like a moral panic around that, but there's been these sort of joking, I guess, semi-joking, sort of slogans like, plant parenthood, people calling themselves plant daddies on Instagram and that sort of thing. And so, from a queer studies standpoint and also an environmental studies standpoint, I'm really interested in how these, like how the plant is coming in to represent all of these like material and social changes, right? So the way people are living is changing, but also the way people are like having sex or not having sex is changing. And so and there's all this like weird eroticization of the plant then, right? That it gets to stand in for the reproduction that's not happening. So that's
Well, I'll keep an eye out for it.
thank you so much again for talking
Oh, thank you, Nicole. I really appreciate you making the time.
and congrats on the book. Very
Thank
exciting.
you very much. Appreciate that.
For more information about both of these books, visit z.umn.edu/things worth keeping and z.umn.edu/bad environmentalism. Thank you for listening.